Jake's cabin sat quietly nestled deep within the towering pine forest, far from the hustle and noise of the nearby town. It was his sanctuary, an escape from city life, where the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant owl. For years, Jake had poured his sweat and heart into building this little haven, piece by piece. Every nail hammered, every beam raised, was a testament to his stubborn love for the land. But that peaceful morning, everything changed. Jake was sipping his morning coffee when he spotted the stark white envelope resting on his doorstep. It was sealed with the official emblem of the Homeowners Association, the dreaded HOA. A cold chill ran down his spine before he even opened it. With hands slightly trembling, Jake tore the envelope open and scanned the letter inside. His heart sank as he read the harsh words. You are hereby ordered to remove the unauthorized structures on your property within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal action. Unauthorized structures. Jake blinked in disbelief. He'd spent months carefully planning every inch of his cabin to meet every regulation. The porch he built last summer, approved by the HOA years ago. The small shed where he kept tools, officially documented. What were they talking about? Jake's mind raced. The letter wasn't just a request, it was a warning, a punishment. Across the community, whispers began to spread like wildfire. Other neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, nervously speculating about what this sudden crackdown meant. The HOA board had always been strict, but this was something new, something aggressive. Jake decided to visit the HOA office, a modest building just a few miles from his cabin. The receptionist's cold stare and clipped answers did little to calm him. The board members, when he finally got to meet them, seemed distant and hostile, as if Jake were a problem to be eliminated rather than a neighbor to be respected. But Jake wasn't the type to back down easily. That night, as he sat by the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames, he felt an unease he couldn't shake. Why now? Why was the HOA suddenly targeting him so harshly? He started asking questions around the neighborhood, quietly, cautiously. It didn't take long before he caught whispers of resentment. The new HOA board had taken over recently, and rumors swirled of personal vendettas and power struggles behind closed doors. But what nobody knew was Jake's secret, one that would soon change everything. Unbeknownst to the HOA board, Jake worked in municipal finance. He was the key person responsible for approving budgets for neighborhood projects, including the HOA's own funding. Every dollar the HOA needed to fix roads, maintain parks, or keep the community safe had to pass through Jake's hands. This was his ace in the hole, a power hidden in plain sight. As Jake stared out the window into the dark woods, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't let these bullies destroy his home, not without a fight. But the question that hung heavy in the air was, how far would the HOA go to punish him? And more importantly, did Jake have what it took to turn the tables before it was too late? The peaceful cabin in the woods was about to become the battleground for a war no one saw coming. Jake woke up the next morning with a knot in his stomach. The letter from the HOA wasn't just an isolated warning, it was a calculated move. But why? What were they hiding beneath their stiff official tone? Determined to get answers, Jake logged into the HOA's online portal, hoping to find meeting minutes, budget reports, anything that could shed light on this sudden crackdown. What he found was troubling. The new HOA board had requested an unusually large budget increase in the past few months, money earmarked for community improvements. But digging deeper, Jake saw the numbers didn't add up. Funds were mysteriously redirected or vanished altogether. Projects stalled, maintenance delayed. Whispers of corruption whispered louder with every line he read. Jake's suspicion grew. The letter wasn't about safety or rules, it was about control. The HOA was trying to strong-arm him, maybe even other homeowners, to distract from their shady dealings. Frustrated but methodical, Jake began attending HOA meetings. The tension was palpable. Board members, normally composed, now seemed twitchy, defensive. Every time Jake raised a question, they dodged or shot back with thinly veiled threats. The community hall filled with murmurs, the air thick with unspoken fears. One night, after a particularly heated meeting, Jake stayed behind, quietly watching the board members disperse. He caught snippets of hushed conversations, mentions of getting rid of the problem, and sending a message. It was chilling. Jake realized this was no ordinary HOA dispute. These people were willing to go far, perhaps dangerously far, to keep their secrets. Meanwhile, Jake's secret loomed like a shadow over them all. As the gatekeeper of the budget approvals, he held the power to either fund or freeze every project the HOA desperately wanted. They had no idea. He began crafting a subtle plan, not an open confrontation, but a game of patience and leverage. Every budget request would be scrutinized, delayed, or denied until the HOA understood that Jake wasn't a target to be bullied. He'd expose their corruption without firing the first shot. But Jake also knew this was risky. Provoking the HOA meant inviting retaliation, and their recent aggression hinted they might resort to anything to silence him. The next few days passed with eerie quiet. Then, late one night, Jake's phone buzzed. His security camera app flashed a live alert. Movement near his cabin. He tapped into the feed, heart pounding. Shadows flickered among the trees, figures moving stealthily toward the cabin. Jake's breath caught. Was this the retaliation he'd feared? The figures paused, almost as if scouting the place. One held what looked like a can of lighter fluid. Jake's fingers trembled as he hit the alarm button on his phone, triggering a loud siren installed for emergencies. The intruders scattered into the darkness, leaving behind the faint smell of smoke and a warning unspoken. Jake knew then, this wasn't just about rules anymore. The HOA was crossing lines, but they still didn't know who they were dealing with. Jake's calm exterior masked a storm brewing inside. His quiet power was about to turn this fight upside down, and he was ready to make sure the HOA's threats backfired spectacularly. As dawn broke over the forest, Jake stared at the rising sun and whispered to himself, "This war is just beginning." The sun had barely risen when Jake sat down at his kitchen table, staring at the live feed from his security cameras. The dark figures from last night lingered in his mind like ghosts. Whoever had come so close to setting his cabin on fire wasn't just a random trespasser. They had a purpose, and that purpose was clear: intimidation. Jake's hands clenched into fists. The HOA's thin veil of civility was shattered. They were willing to cross dangerous lines to make him comply. But Jake was no ordinary homeowner. He had a secret weapon, and he wasn't afraid to use it. By day, Jake worked as a municipal finance officer, a key gatekeeper for local budget approvals. The HOA's funding, every maintenance dollar, every improvement project, depended on his nod, and until now, the HOA had no idea. Jake tapped his fingers on the table, weighing his options. He could expose the HOA immediately, but that might escalate the danger to his family and property. Instead, he chose a subtler path, a game of patience and power. He would control their budget approvals like a puppeteer, pulling strings behind the scenes. Every request from the HOA would face rigorous scrutiny. Projects would stall, funds would be frozen, and slowly, the community's trust in their board would crumble. But this was a dangerous game. The HOA had already shown they weren't afraid to use fire, literal fire, as a weapon. One wrong move, and Jake's cabin, his sanctuary, could be reduced to ashes. Jake spent the next few days quietly gathering evidence. He requested detailed breakdowns of HOA spending, cross-referenced invoices, and tracked suspicious transactions. The deeper he dug, the more corruption he uncovered: inflated contracts, phantom vendors, and unauthorized expenses. He also made sure his security system was upgraded, with cameras covering every angle of his property, motion detectors, and a direct line to local law enforcement. Meanwhile, the HOA board grew increasingly restless. Meetings became more heated, with board members whispering about that troublesome homeowner who was causing delays. Rumors swirled that Jake was abusing his position, but no one had proof. One evening, at a community barbecue, Jake overheard a hushed conversation between two board members near the edge of the crowd. "We need to handle him before it gets worse," one hissed. The other nodded grimly. He thinks he controls everything with that budget nonsense. If we don't act soon, he'll ruin us. Jake's stomach tightened. They were planning something. But what? That night, as the forest grew silent, Jake's phone buzzed again, another alert from his security cameras. He stared in disbelief as the live feed showed the same shadowy figures returning, this time carrying tools and a large container of accelerant. But Jake was ready. He activated his home's floodlights, blinding the intruders, and triggered an alarm that echoed through the woods. The attackers scattered, leaving behind footprints and a chilling message. They were not done. Jake's calm demeanor cracked for a moment. This was no longer just a battle over property lines and regulations. It was a fight for survival. Still, deep inside, Jake smiled grimly. The HOA thought they could bully him, threaten him with fire, and silence him. But they didn't realize he held the keys to their very existence. With each stalled project and frozen dollar, their power was slipping. And Jake was ready to watch it all burn on his terms. The days that followed were like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. Jake kept his composure, but every glance over his shoulder reminded him the threat was real and closer than ever. He didn't confront the HOA directly. Instead, he unleashed a silent but crushing retaliation. Every budget request from the HOA was slowed, stalled, or outright denied. At first, the delays seemed like minor bureaucratic obstacles, little things like missing paperwork or requests for extra documentation. But soon, the ripple effect spread. The neighborhood pool repairs were postponed. Streetlight maintenance was cancelled. The much-anticipated playground upgrade was put on indefinite hold. Frustration mounted within the HOA board. At their meetings, the usual veneer of politeness cracked, replaced by heated arguments and frantic phone calls. Rumors spread through the community that the HOA was losing its grip. Meanwhile, Jake watched quietly from his cabin, his security system his silent sentinel. He knew the HOA's desperation would only grow, and desperation could make people dangerous. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and golds, Jake's phone buzzed with another alert. This time, it wasn't just movement, there was something else. Smoke. Jake's heart hammered as he checked the security feed. Near the far edge of his property, a small fire smoldered, the smoke curling up through the trees. The fire was small, contained, but deliberate. Someone was sending a message. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his fire extinguisher and sprinted outside, beating down the flames before they could spread. The scorched ground and singed leaves were the only evidence left of the attack. His neighbors, roused by the noise, gathered warily, eyes filled with suspicion and fear. Who would do this? Someone whispered. Jake met their gaze steadily. Someone who thinks they can scare me. The community was shaken, and whispers of the cabin fire spread fast. The HOA board issued a statement condemning any acts of vandalism, but carefully avoided mentioning Jake directly. Behind the scenes, however, their anxiety was growing. Jake knew this was a turning point. The HOA's attempts to intimidate him were escalating, and if he wasn't careful, things could spiral out of control. Still, he refused to back down. In fact, he stepped up his game. Quietly, Jake began documenting everything. The letters, the threats, the suspicious activities near his cabin. He hired a local private investigator to monitor the HOA board's movements and uncover any further illegal actions. Jake also reached out to a few trusted neighbors, building a small coalition of homeowners tired of the HOA's abuses. Together, they began gathering signatures for a community vote to replace the corrupt board. But even as hope flickered, the tension grew. The HOA was no longer just a governing body, they were an enemy. And the longer Jake delayed their funding, the more dangerous their desperation became. Every creak in the night, every shadow at the edge of the forest, felt like a warning. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the next attack might be even worse. One cold, moonless night, Jake lay awake listening. The wind rustled through the trees, but beneath it, he thought he heard something else, a whisper of movement, too deliberate to be natural. He reached over to his phone and quietly activated the night vision cameras. A figure slipped silently through the underbrush, carrying what looked like a large canister. Jake's blood ran cold. The HOA's silent threat was escalating to something far more sinister. The game was no longer about budgets or bylaws. It was about survival. The community hall buzzed with tension. Tonight's HOA meeting was unlike any before. Jake knew the board was on edge. They could feel the weight of his silent war pressing down on them. Rows of neighbors filled the seats, whispers floating through the air like a storm about to break. Everyone had heard about the fires, the stalled projects, and the mounting corruption rumors. The community was divided, some suspicious of the HOA's actions, others fearful of backlash. Jake took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium, the room falling into a hush. "I'm here because our community deserves better," he began, voice steady but firm. "The HOA board has been using intimidation and fear to silence voices, especially mine. And now, it's time to shed light on what's really going on." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jake continued, "I've reviewed financial records and discovered that the board has been misusing funds for personal gain. They've stalled critical repairs and tried to push me out by threatening my property. I have evidence of attempts to intimidate me, and even to burn down my cabin." Gasps filled the room. The tension was electric. The board members exchanged nervous glances, their usual confidence replaced by growing panic. One of the board members, Linda, stood abruptly. "That's a serious accusation, Jake. Do you have proof, or are you just trying to sabotage the HOA?" Jake nodded slowly. "I have documents, videos, and witness testimonies. And if necessary, I'm prepared to bring this to the authorities." The room exploded into whispers and side conversations. Supporters of Jake stood, some clapping quietly, while others looked worried, unsure what to believe. Suddenly, another board member, Tom, slammed his fist on the table. "You think you control everything with your budget approvals? This isn't your personal playground. You're abusing your power." Jake met his glare without flinching. "I control nothing that isn't earned. If the HOA was transparent and honest, none of this would be happening." The showdown laid bare the deep divisions in the community. Neighbors who had been silent for too long were finally speaking up, sharing their own frustrations with the board's secrecy and incompetence. But the board fought back fiercely, accusing Jake of harassment, of trying to manipulate the community through fear. Amid the chaos, Jake dropped a bombshell. "I have recordings of private conversations where board members admit to targeting me to cover their tracks. This isn't just politics, it's criminal." The room fell deathly silent. Eyes darted between Jake and the board members, the truth hanging heavily in the air. As the meeting ended, Jake stepped down from the podium, feeling the weight of what he'd unleashed. The community was awake now, no longer willing to turn a blind eye. But the HOA board was not defeated. Their desperation showed in the hurried whispers and angry stares as they left the hall. Outside, Jake was greeted by a mix of supporters and skeptics. One elderly neighbor gripped his arm tightly. "Thank you for standing up. We've been scared for too long." But others warned quietly, "Be careful, Jake. They're dangerous." That night, Jake sat by his cabin window, the shadows playing tricks on his mind. The confrontation had been a victory, but the fight was far from over. If anything, it had just gotten worse. The HOA was wounded, cornered, and the more desperate they became, the more unpredictable their next move. Jake's phone buzzed again with an alert. His security cameras showed a car slowly circling his property, a silent threat under the cover of darkness. Jake's jaw tightened. They had made their move. But so had he. The night was thick with tension as Jake sat in his cabin, eyes glued to the multiple security monitors arranged on his desk. The dim glow from the screens cast eerie shadows on the walls, but Jake barely noticed. He was alert, aware that the last few weeks had turned his peaceful retreat into a fortress under siege. The car that had circled his property earlier hadn't returned, but that didn't mean the threat was over. The HOA's desperation was palpable. They were playing a dangerous game, and Jake could feel their moves tightening around him like a noose. His phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. Drop the fight, Jake. Last warning, or things get worse. Jake's blood ran cold. This was no longer about property disputes or petty politics. This was intimidation, pure and simple. But Jake wasn't about to back down. He typed back, "You want to play with fire? Just remember who controls the flame." He hit send before doubt could creep in. The next morning, Jake called his trusted private investigator Maria, who had been digging into the HOA board's affairs. She arrived at the cabin just as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. "We've uncovered more than just budget fraud," Maria said grimly. "There's evidence some board members have been involved in illegal dumping and even attempts to sabotage rival homeowners' properties." Jake clenched his fists. "That explains the fires. This isn't just intimidation, it's sabotage." Maria nodded. "And there's more. A local police officer, supposedly loyal to the HOA, has been tipping them off about our investigations." Jake's jaw tightened. The corruption ran deeper than he imagined. That afternoon, Jake met with a group of concerned neighbors at the community center. He shared the new information and urged them to stand united. "This isn't just my fight anymore," Jake said. "It's ours. We need to demand a full independent investigation and vote to replace this corrupt board." The neighbors nodded, energized but wary. But that evening, as Jake returned home, the air felt heavier. The wind whispered through the trees like a warning. His security system picked up movement near the cabin's back entrance. Jake's heart pounded as he grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. A figure darted into the shadows before he could get a clear look. The next morning, Jake discovered a chilling message scrawled on his cabin door in charcoal. "Stop or burn." His pulse raced. The threats were escalating, but so was his resolve. Jake contacted the local sheriff and filed a formal complaint. Officers promised increased patrols and surveillance. Still, Jake knew he couldn't rely solely on the law. He had to outsmart the HOA's dangerous game. That night, he set up motion sensors and infrared cameras around his property, covering every possible approach. As he sat by the fireplace, the cabin's cozy glow felt at odds with the cold reality outside. The line between safety and danger was razor thin. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was the HOA president, voiced icy but controlled. "Jake, this has gone too far. You're threatening the community's peace. We suggest you reconsider before someone gets hurt." Jake didn't flinch. "You're the ones threatening me. I'm just making sure the community knows the truth." The call ended with a chilling silence. Jake stared at the phone, realizing the fight was no longer just about him. It was about exposing a network of lies and threats buried beneath the HOA's facade. He glanced out the window, where the dark forest seemed to press in. The final warning had been delivered, but Jake was ready. The battle for his home and the entire community was about to reach its breaking point. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a fever pitch. The once quiet streets now buzzed with whispered conversations and suspicious glances. Jake's warnings and evidence had ignited a spark in the community, but the HOA board was fighting back with everything they had. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was electric, charged with fear, anger, and uncertainty. The room was packed, with every seat filled and many standing. The community had finally come together, but the fight was far from over. Jake took the stage once more, determined to reveal the full extent of the HOA's corruption and threats. His voice carried the weight of every sleepless night, every warning burned into his door, every shadow lurking around his cabin. "I have evidence of fraud, intimidation, and attempts to sabotage homeowners. We can no longer let this continue," Jake declared, holding up stacks of documents and videos. "This board has betrayed our trust, and it's time for change." The crowd erupted in murmurs and nods. Many had suffered quietly for too long. But then, the HOA president stood, his face hard and defiant. "These accusations are baseless and slanderous," he spat. "Jake is abusing his position for personal gain." Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A collective gasp filled the air, then a tense silence. Emergency lights cast an eerie red glow, revealing a few figures moving swiftly toward the exits. Panic threatened to rise as rumors of sabotage spread. In the chaos, a loud crash echoed from the back of the hall. Someone had thrown a heavy object against the wall, a brick, shattering a window. Jake's heart pounded. The intimidation was escalating, now threatening everyone in the community. Outside, flashing police lights illuminated the scene, drawing more residents to the windows. The HOA president tried to regain control, but his voice was drowned out by rising voices demanding justice. Suddenly, the door burst open and 2 police officers entered, their expressions grim. "We received reports of threats and disturbances," one said. "We're here to ensure everyone's safety." Jake's evidence was handed over to them, and the officers promised to investigate thoroughly. The meeting ended with a vote of no confidence in the HOA board. The community had spoken. But as Jake walked out, he felt eyes burning into his back, silent threats promising this war was far from over. Later that night, as Jake returned to his cabin, he noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt, too close to be coincidence. His phone buzzed again, a final message from the unknown number. "You've won the battle, but not the war. Watch your back." Jake looked toward the dark forest, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. He knew this was only the beginning of a long, dangerous road. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small, determined smile. They had underestimated him, and he was ready for whatever came next. Days passed since the intense HOA meeting, but the air in the neighborhood remained thick with tension. Jake knew the threats wouldn't stop just because the board was voted out. Desperation breeds danger, and he was prepared for their next move. But then something unexpected happened. One morning, Jake received an official letter, not from the HOA board, but from the city council. It was a formal notification. A special audit and investigation would be launched into the HOA's finances and conduct, led by independent state officials. Jake's careful documentation and the community's united voice had made a real impact. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Yet, even with the investigation underway, the shadows lingered. Late one evening, Jake heard a knock at his door. Heart pounding, he cautiously opened it to find Linda, the former HOA board member who had once confronted him at the meetings. "I want to talk," she said quietly, eyes filled with something between fear and relief. Inside the cabin, Linda revealed a shocking secret. "The fires, the threats, they weren't what you thought," she confessed. "Some on the board acted alone, desperate to keep their schemes hidden. But others, they tried to stop it. I've been working behind the scenes to gather evidence and help you." Jake was stunned. The enemy had been fractured, and not everyone had been willing to play dirty. Linda handed him a USB drive filled with recordings and documents exposing the most corrupt members. "This is the real reason they targeted you," she said. "They feared you'd uncover everything." Jake realized this was the turning point. The HOA's grip was finally breaking. The investigation proceeded swiftly. The state officials uncovered widespread fraud and criminal activities. Several board members were arrested, charged with embezzlement and intimidation. The community, once divided, began to heal. New leadership was elected, homeowners who cared about transparency, fairness, and rebuilding trust. Jake's cabin, once a target of threats and arson attempts, became a symbol of resilience. The community rallied to help him repair the small scars left behind. But the biggest surprise came when Jake was asked to lead the new HOA Financial Oversight Committee. His expertise and dedication made him the perfect candidate to ensure history didn't repeat itself. Standing on his cabin's porch one evening, Jake looked out over the peaceful neighborhood, the quiet streets, the repaired playground, the streetlights shining steadily. He smiled, knowing the fight had been worth it, not just for him, but for everyone who called this place home. The last message from that unknown number echoed in his mind, but now it felt different. "You've won the battle, but not the war." Jake knew that vigilance would always be necessary. But now, he held the power to protect his community, and no threat, no matter how dark, could ever burn that down.